Okay, we are recording, and it is the book of Daniel that we are going to be going through tonight. Now, please let me just remind ourselves this is a survey. This is not an in-depth study. If we were going to do an in-depth study of Daniel in particular in chapters 7 through 11, we would have to be taking a great amount of time in Ezekiel and in Isaiah and in Revelation. So this is a survey. We will hit the highlights, but there is so much detailed information about Daniel himself as a man of God, and several things as I refreshed myself in this study that I learned once again. And I think there are some things that probably you did not know about this young man. So let's go ahead and begin. Daniel the man. If you have your Bibles, you might want to open up to Daniel chapter 1. And in chapter 1, there is a lot of pertinent information about Daniel. In verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. Daniel was part of either the royal family or one of the nobles, one of the prominent families. Verse 4 says that he had no physical distractions, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So, another thing about Daniel here is he has been gifted with a tremendous amount of intellect. And this gave him a level of maturity well beyond his years and beyond his contemporaries. And as we see the life of Daniel develop, we will take careful note of that and how God placed him in this difficult situation as the most vital place for Daniel to be used by God to advance the program of God. He is an excellent communicator. In verse 8, Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. And God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And you can read the rest of this story. This is the first major test that Daniel, at a very early age, would encounter. And he had his convictions, and he is able to communicate with the commander over these young people in preparation to serve in the Babylonian royal court. He was able to communicate why he could not do this, but he also proposed a plan of evaluation and left the final decision with the commander. And I did a series when we first started on the GoToMeeting Bible studies about how to appeal to an ungodly authority. And it's very easy for us to complain. I can't do that because I'm a Christian. It will violate my conscience and different things like that. But we don't take the extra step to propose an alternative, laying out some guidelines like Daniel did. Let us have our dietary food that we are accustomed to eating, test us for 7 days, and then you evaluate how we look. And basically, the Babylonians thought when you eat rich food and drink great wine and different things like that, you will improve your countenance. And Daniel, being a Jew, knew that for him that was not so. He's an excellent communicator. You will see that when he interprets the various dreams that the kings have as well. He is respectful of authority. In verses 8 to 16, as I have mentioned, he respects the authority. The captain says, look, I'm kind of afraid I'm going to lose my head if you don't eat this food that I'm presenting. And when Daniel made the alternative plan, God had granted him favor. And the captain says, okay, we will try it for 7 days. And Daniel left the decision with him to decide if Daniel and his friends were just as well fit or maybe even better than those that were on this rich diet of the Babylonians. And so he has a respect for authority. And I've often wondered, and we will never know, I often wondered that if for some reason the captain would come back after 7 days and said, nope, you need to go back to eating what I'm bringing to you, and how Daniel would respond. I think I know how Daniel would respond, but God did not allow him to be faced with such a huge decision. And he was an interpreter of visions and dreams in verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And we will see this under 3 of the 4 empires that he served in. He interpreted visions and dreams of the kings. And then finally, he is guileless. In verse 5 of chapter 6, you remember the story of all the different people that were serving Darius of the Medes and the Persians, and they wanted to get rid of Daniel. And so they went to Darius and said, look, let's develop a decree that nobody can pray to any other gods or anybody else except to you. And they were looking for a means of accusation. And in verse 5, it says of chapter 6, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. So even though he is in a worldly, godless, evil, pagan culture, Daniel is living above the skirmish. Daniel served under 4 foreign kings. He served under Nebuchadnezzar and was elevated because he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, chapter 2, verse 48. He served under Belshazzar after he interprets the handwriting on the wall, chapter 5, verse 29. Now, Belshazzar is the son to Nebuchadnezzar. He served under Darius the Mede, and Darius leaned on him because he had an extraordinary spirit, according to Daniel 6, verse 1 through 3. And that's why all of the other counselors to Darius were envious and threatened by Daniel. And then he served under Cyrus the Persian. And in Isaiah, if you remember, God speaks of Cyrus as my servant who would discipline Israel. His Chaldean name is Bel, the T is silent, and the E is silent, Belshazzar. That means Bel will protect him. Some people pronounce it Belteshazzar or Belteshazzar. And it's the Chaldean name. Remember, their names were changed. Their names were changed. Their clothing was changed. Their language was changed. The literature was changed. Everything was changed, even as we saw in a few minutes ago, the attempt to go ahead and change their diet. So Daniel gets this new name along with his three friends, and his name means Bel protect him. Now, he ministered the entire 70 years of Babylonian captivity. He went into captivity, and we'll get to this in a moment, at a very early age, and he died in captivity. He was somewhere in his 80s when he was cast into the lion's den. Many people believe that he was young when he was cast into the lion's den, but if you do the math between Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, where he was cast into the lion's den, you will come up with his age being an elder statesman in his 80s. And then here's a surprising fact. Daniel meets both Gabriel, the archangel, and Michael, the archangel. Remember, Gabriel in the Bible is the one who gives clarification, who makes divine pronouncements sent by God. Michael is the warrior angel. And if you read those verses there, Michael has to battle through the enemy of Greece, I believe, trying to get Daniel the interpretation about some of the end time events. I did not know that Daniel met both of these angels. I found that a very interesting fact. Now, his death. Here's what we don't know. There is no clear historical record of Daniel's death. Many estimate he was about 82 years old when he died, more than likely of natural causes. This means he was a young teen, 16, 17, 18 years old, when taken in the first exile under Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar raided Jerusalem 3 times, 605, 597, and then 586 is when he destroyed the temple and the city and left the elderly and the infirm behind. These were the people that Nehemiah and Ezra would go, and they would rebuild the temple and rehang the gates and rebuild the walls. Now, one source thought his tomb was among the kings of Media, while others believed he was buried in the capital city of Susa, and that his personal dwelling contained many of the golden fixtures from Solomon's temple. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar sent down a delegation under King Hezekiah, and in a very shrewd move, Hezekiah showed this delegation, this Babylonian delegation, the wealth of the temple of Solomon. And so when they came in and raided things in 605, They knew exactly where to go and where to pick up these precious solid gold fixtures. I don't know whether that is true or not. If it is, I guess the question I would have is how in the world did Daniel smuggle them down into Susa and keep them hid for 60 plus years without discovery? So I think this might be a biblical myth, and these items come from historians of the day like Josephus, and they write what they think took place. Again, there is no clear documentation for the two things that I've listed above. Let's talk about Daniel the book. Chapters 1 through 6, we see Daniel's two major tests. The first one, as we talked about, was dietary in chapter 1. Now, for Daniel, this was a matter of obedience to conscience and the law. As a Jew, they had a strict dietary code that God gave to Moses, who instructed the people. So it became a matter of law, and as the Jews practiced the law, it became then a matter of conscience and conviction. Then the second test was idolatry in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's golden idol. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on in more detail. But in chapter 2, he erects a idol of himself. And here for Daniel, it's a matter of worship. It's a matter of worship. Also, a matter of the law. Thou shalt have no graven images before me. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God and him only. So Daniel, at a very young age, has developed biblical convictions that, when lived by, would preserve him and would also honor and glorify Jehovah. And I guess the thing that I want to impress upon us, Daniel would stand out like a sore thumb in our culture today among our young people. The majority of our young people, they lack conscience that is governed by biblical truth. They are driven by their feelings. They are driven by the psychobabble of our culture and world. And sometimes, unfortunately, they are driven by our Christian culture that has watered down the gospel and only communicates God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and he understands how life is so tough and difficult. Just try to do better. And then the second act of idolatry was the decree of Darius, and this was a matter of prayer and allegiance. In chapter 6, as I've mentioned, these advisors to Darius wanted to get rid of Daniel and find an accusation against him. And so they came up with this plan for Darius to sign a decree. No one can pray to anybody but Darius. And Daniel has law, has conscience, and understands that even that is a form of idolatry, and he refuses to go ahead and do that. Now, I've listed here a matter of prayer and allegiance, and I get that from the fact that Daniel did not change his prayer routine. If you read the story very carefully, a Jew, even in captivity, faced towards Jerusalem with their windows open if they were in a structure. Now, if Daniel didn't want to get thrown in the lion's den, he very well could have closed his door or pulled his curtain. He could have closed the windows. He could have taken a walk and had a prayer walk. He could have done several different things to avoid the entrapment of these people. But instead, every day, he opened his windows, he knelt, and he prayed towards Jerusalem. He was not ashamed, and he was not going to take the easy way out. That would have watered down his convictions. Chapter 2 talks about the history of world empires. And you can read that on your own, and I'll show you a diagram here in just a little bit. In fact, let me just go ahead and show you that diagram now. This is what you see in Daniel 2. The head of gold is the Assyrio-Babylonish monarchy, or the lion, in particular Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. The Babylonian Empire is the head of gold in Nebuchadnezzar's idol. The breastplate and arms of silver are the Medo-Persian Empire, and they were headed up by Cyrus and Darius. And then the belly and the thighs of brass was the Greco-Macedonian kingdom. This would have been Alexander the Great. And then the legs of iron is the Roman Empire under the various Caesars. And you have the dates there. And then the feet and the 10 toes are the various kingdoms, I believe, that are yet future, known as the European Compact. And that would be Italy, France, England, Belgium, Holland, Portugal, Prussia, Australia, Spain, and Greece once again. Now, these all had their historical places, but I believe that they also form part of the European Compact that has been trying to gain ground and momentum for at least a decade, to my knowledge. So this is chapter 2. This is what you read about in chapter 2. Now, let me go back. So in chapter 3, we have the golden image and Daniel's 3 friends. There was an edict given that when you hear all of these instruments, you are to pay homage by bowing down and worshiping the idol. Daniel's 3 friends refused to do that. Now I'm going to pose a hypothetical situation, not a hypo. I'm going to propose a conclusion to you from my perspective. Daniel's three friends did not bow down. They refused to bow down. And in fact, it says when they were about, verse 16 of chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. See, they were hauled up before the king. "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter." What are they saying? "Neb, you should know that we're not going to do this. How long have we served in your court?" Well, how in the world did they get serving in Nebuchadnezzar's court? Well, if you go back to chapter 2, verse 49, and Daniel made request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. That's how they got in. So Nebuchadnezzar knew the character of these 3 because he knew the character of Daniel. And in verse 16 of chapter 3, they said, "We don't need to give you an answer whether we're going to bow down or not, because the king is giving them a second chance." Verse 17, This is a powerful verse. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of our hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. What a powerful, powerful declaration of faith. Now, here's my synopsis, if you please, or my summary. I believe Daniel's three friends were there when Daniel told the captain of the hosts about this dietary stuff, that they can't do it. I believe he was speaking corporately for his three friends as well. And because Daniel took a stand and God honored that stand, I believe he had an impact on his three friends, and his three friends were able to do the same thing. Now, in chapter 4, I entitled it Nebuchadnezzar's Conversion. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has this vision of the great tree. And it in verse 11, it says the tree grew large, 4:11, and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. This is talking about his kingdom. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. The Babylonian Empire was massive and expansive, and it covered a huge portion of the then known globe, and it provided wonderful things to those who came underneath the Babylonian captivity. Now, he has a dream, and the tree is cut down. The stump is left. He's troubled by the dream. And so Daniel is called to interpret the dream. Verse 22 of chapter 4. It is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. In that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him, 7 years. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field, and you will be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you, until you recognize the Most High ruler. The Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And in that it was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree, your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. So Daniel says, hey, dude, judgment is impending. It is forecasted to come, but you can prolong it. You can avoid it if you will repent. Nebuchadnezzar was a proud man. Look at all that I've built. That's what he says in verse 28. And all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 1 year later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king reflected and said, Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and of the glory of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you, so forth and so on. Verse 34. But at the end of that period, Nebuchadnezzar is now writing in his diary, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will in the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can ward off his hand or say to him, What have you done? At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and my surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Neb got converted, but he went through 7 painful years of predicted judgment he might have been able to avoid if he humbled himself. Chapter 5, I've entitled Like Father, Like Son. And this is Belshazzar, and he is just having a great wild time. He's the son of Nebuchadnezzar who has died, so he has inherited the Babylonian throne. And they are drinking and carrying on, verse 3, using the vessels from the temple of the house of God. And they're carrying on with all sorts of idolatry. Verse 5, suddenly a finger begins writing on the wall. Verse 6, the king gets alarmed. He calls all of his people up, and they cannot give him an answer. Finally, he calls up Daniel. And as Daniel comes, he tells the king what is going on and the message on the wall. And he says in verse 25, now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekle upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and will put an end to it. Tekne, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Belshazzar wants to reward Daniel. And several times this took place. Daniel did not ask for these things. In fact, sometimes Daniel, in fact, chapter 6, told the king, let's see if I can go back here and find it, chapter 5, verse 17, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Daniel was not in it for the money. How so much different from our televangelists and other um, evangelical Protestant preachers sometimes. Chapter 6 is the prayer trap. I mentioned that to you already. The decree that they came up with. Daniel continues to follow his pattern. The king is very, very concerned. He cannot revoke the edict. Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. The king cannot sleep. He gets up in the morning. He rushes to the den and he calls out, Daniel, has your God kept you? And Daniel answered in the affirmative. And in verse 28 of chapter 6, Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now we come to the prophetic portion of the book of Daniel. And again, beloved, this is a survey, so I'm simply going to summarize. Chapter 7 through 12, vision of the four beasts. Chapter 7 gives us the preview of the great tribulation that will take place. Chapter 8 is the vision of the ram and the goat, the ram being the Medo-Persian Empire that would take over the Babylonian Empire, and then the goat, which is Greece under Alexander the Great, would take over the Medo-Persian Empire. And that goes back to the statue that I showed to you earlier. And then in 9 through 12, we have Daniel praying and the vision of the end times in chapters 9 through 12. And this is where we are introduced to Michael, the archangel of war, who had to battle through to get to Daniel to give him the interpretation of the vision. So this is Daniel 2 again, the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. There's varying reports about how tall this statue was. Somebody estimated it was 56 feet high. I suppose in that day they might have been able to do that if they had one giant stone and tremendous stone crafters. I'm not quite sure. It was large enough to be seen from any part of the capital, that when the people heard the sound, they would look towards the statue and fall down. So in reality, Daniel 2 is a picture of Daniel 9 through, Daniel 7 through 12, and the various empires, how one succeeded the other. Now let's draw some applications for today. Like Daniel, God moves us into the best place to serve Him. I believe this is absolutely true. And I hope if you are serving Him today, that you know that you are in the best place to serve Him. It's not a mistake. He has brought you to this place to serve Him. It doesn't mean, like Daniel, you will stay there until you die. It means you stay there until you complete the good works He has ordained for you to do before the foundations of the world at that location. Like Daniel, we receive a reward from God, not men. And these verses here that I've listed for you is how Gabriel addresses, I apologize, how Daniel responds to these kings trying to give him things. I think Daniel understood that royal rewards might indenture him to become a yes man. Proverbs talks about bribery and gifts. Like Daniel, small decisions and convictions prepare us for the larger test of faith. I believe this is what happened with Daniel, and then he impacted his three friends, but Daniel's contemporaries more than likely were dead. They were gone. Probably a whole new generation that went into exile with Daniel had already reproduced. There was a second generation of exiles that probably did not know Daniel or much about him, except he's a ruler. And wow, is he for us or for the current governmental people? But Daniel's small decisions that he made, I believe, helped him to stand the largest test in his life, where he refused to go ahead and pray to any other God but to God and enter the lion's den with confidence. Like Daniel, when we model our convictions, we impact others. I believe that's what Daniel did with his three friends. They were able to say, "O king, whether our God rescues us or not, you need to know we are not going to bow down." And like Daniel, when we earnestly pray for enlightenment, God grants us knowledge, wisdom, and discernment. Is it going to come right away? No. But it will come if we are earnestly praying to know, what does this mean, God? Because when you know what God means about a text, now you are part of being thoroughly equipped for the service of God in the lives of other people. And then finally, this is the last verse in the book of Daniel. I didn't notice this before. Daniel would not see his allotted portion until the end. And I'm going to take this in a symbolic way, like Jeremiah, who poured his life into that ministry and saw no results, but he will see the rewards of his hand that was blessed by God at the end. It may not be until we get to heaven, beloved, that as we kneel before the throne, Jesus is going to point out, that's what I accomplished through you. That's what I accomplished through you. Look there. That's what I accomplished through you. Next week, we begin the minor prophets. Minor only in the sense that they don't have as many chapters, not that they are of less significance. And we are going to start out with Hosea. We're going to look into the Word of God and study about Hosea. The name means Yahweh is salvation. So you got part of your notes already for next week. Thoughts, questions, something I need to go back and try to explain? I know there was a lot of material, and I know I did not give you an expanded outline. You had to work.
Okay. Turned it off, I turned it on.
I don't know.
I like Daniel.
What?
I always like studying about him.
Oh, yeah.
I go back, I refer a lot to his prayer that he does in chapter 9.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the strength of convictions regardless of the consequences.
Yeah. I know.
Out of Daniel and his three friends. Yeah.
Yep.
And from such a young age, he just determined it. That's just amazing.
I think that is a reflection, although we don't have any historical record, I think that's a reflection on his parenting.
Mm-hmm.
how mom and dad raised him and the limited time that they had with him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right,
I like chapter 14.
go ahead.
Which chapter?
Chapter 14 is the Bell and the Dragon. That's in the Apocrypha. That's not
Oh,
in our Bible.
Apocrypha. He's being a
I was
wiseacre.
fixing to say chapter 14. I'm missing something.
The Apocrypha.
Ah, yeah, Apocrypha.
Well, it said it was in the Septuagint account, so I don't know where they. I guess it's not really inspired.
No, it's not. That's why it's apocryphal.
Yeah.
And that's why it's only included in the Septuagint and transferred over